Good evening, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming out to the Kansas House of Representatives District 43 candidate forum this evening. Introduce myself, my name is Jason Lyve. I'm the President and CEO of the Garnder Chamber of Commerce. Commerce is happy to support and promote civic engagement through holding this forum this evening. For the benefit of the crowd, to let everyone know, we are live streaming this event on Facebook Live tonight. It will be available on votejoco.com later and as well on the Garnder Chamber of Commerce Facebook page. Because of the recording, I've asked that those of you who are here in attendance live, please keep noise levels down so that the answers from the candidates can come through on that. So I should be able to take both of the candidates' responses, use that information, process that, and use that for your voting decision. So please be respectful in your responses. Keep those muted this evening. Prior to getting this evening, we had a coin toss to determine who will go first on opening statements. I will ask questions. Each candidate will have 2 minutes to respond. We'll alternate the answers to those questions. And closing statements, we will switch and go in reverse order. Mics are live, so you may have heard me address this moments ago, but I've asked the candidates to introduce themselves as we do our opening statements. So we'll go ahead and get started. And candidates, please introduce yourself. And opening statements, we'll start with Mr. Davenport. Please go ahead, 3 minutes.
Hi there, my name is Keith Davenport, and you can hear me well. So yesterday I was meeting with a college student who just started a new business, and I should tell you part of my day job. I lead a nonprofit that does funding from the Kaufman Foundation that helps business owners and economic development organizations, chambers of commerce, and other community stakeholders work on business and job retention. So this entrepreneur, he's a junior in college. He got a bunch of postings together and started his own business, and he came in, he had no idea that I was running for office because this was in a work situation, and the first thing he said is, you know what, our elected officials don't do a very good job representing us. They just represent party all the time, and so he was telling me all this because his new business is a tech industry, an app that puts information together about a community and then helps identify what are the common themes and the common interests in the community. And the idea of a community being represented in Topeka is one of the things that's driven me to run. I look around this room and I see many of you I've talked to over the last few months who've talked to me about your desire to engage with our elected officials over these past few years and the lack of response you receive oftentimes from emails. I've heard about form letters. Even myself, I know there's been times that I've reached out to different elected officials and that's not okay. We need somebody who represents our common good in Topeka. A few months ago, I went to a baseball camp. I took my 9-year-old to go and learn these new skills and meet friends. And I was at the Garnder High School baseball field and just sitting in the bleachers with other families from the community. And getting to watch him load the skills was great. And as I was doing that, I pulled out my phone and I started scrolling through different articles in the news. And it was one article was all the Republicans blaming all the Democrats for all the problems we're having in the world. And then the next article was all the Democrats blaming all the Republicans for all the problems we have in the world. It was just back and forth, back and forth. And it's not just the blaming game, but just the level of ferocity in that blame. And I had this moment that just felt so surreal as I looked up from my phone and looked around the bleachers beside me and just saw these families all sitting together with their kids, just enjoying having small talk and enjoying the fact that their kids are a part of this community engagement activity and making all these new friends. And what was clear in that moment, nobody was asking each other, are you a Republican or are you a Democrat? Because in the day-to-day ways that we live our lives, what party we back means much less than what community we belong to. And we need to have representatives who understand the day-to-day needs that we have and advocate for practical solutions to solve those. My wife and I moved out here after I finished my undergraduate degree in pastoral ministry for me to go to National Theological Seminary in 2008. We didn't have any kids at the time, we have 4 now. I spent about 10 years working in the Church of the Nazarene and an ordained minister with the Church of the Nazarene. Spent about 6 years managing student life and leadership development at JCCC. And thank you very much for the opportunity to be here tonight.
Thank you. Mr. Sutton, 3 minutes, introduction and opening statement.
Very good. All right, I am Representative Bill Sutton from the 43rd District. You're smack dab in the middle of it. I've been representing the 43rd District since 2013, or elected in 2012. served since 2013. In my capacity as the representative, I've served in a number of committees that touch upon almost every facet of our lives. From appropriations, where I currently reside, and commerce, which has a very big impact going in just northwest of us here in the near future. But we also, I've also worked on K-12 budget, Education Committee, Transportation budget. If you notice the theme there's a whole lot of budget committees. That's really what I do. I've spent the last 10 years staring at spreadsheets because that's the excitement that we find in Topeka. I heard the comment about partisanship, and I think there's an element of truth to that. But that's not something that we find consistently in budget committees. Budgets are about the numbers. What works, what isn't working, what needs to be more funded, what doesn't need to be funded at all because it's ineffective. Those are the decisions that we deal with. Very rarely are those partisan votes, occasionally, but for the most part, it's trying to solve the number puzzle that's presented to us every single year. So I'd love to say that we get into the big partisan squabbles, but maybe that's 10 or 12 votes out of the year. Most of the time, the votes are very bipartisan. You'll notice things like the Apex bill that we passed this year, for example. Very bipartisan. I mean, I think the governor was pushing it, the Commerce Department was pushing it, the Lieutenant Governor was absolutely pushing it. He was sitting in Commerce at the time. So there was a whole lot of work being done all across the aisle to get that thing across the finish line in a package that made sense, that held the company, at the time I didn't even know who it was, that held some random company accountable and measured the results. And I think that's the essence of good legislation. I think we developed a fine package from that, and I'm happy to have voted for it. Thank you for having me this evening, by the way.
All right, thank you. We will get into the Q&A now. Mr. Sutton will start first with you this time. 2 minutes on the question, and it won't be in depth, but it will set a little bit of what your priorities are. So as a candidate, what are your top 3 policy issues?
Well, I kind of started on that one already. As a budget guy, of course, my main focus, my first priority is always going to be responsible budgeting. Once upon a time, I thought that was a challenge when we didn't have money after the 2009 recovering, and it was kind of messy. When we had zero money in the budget, I thought that was difficult. But then we had COVID, and we're awash with federal funds. That was a whole lot more challenging, because now, there's money for everything, and it turned into the folks presenting at our committees, it turned into hungry hippos, I'm telling you. Everyone wanted money. Everyone had their priorities. It was a real challenge to deal responsibly with one-time money. This wasn't long-term money. This wasn't an income stream. This was one-time money. So we had to focus on how do we get rid of debt, how do we save money, and how do we not grow government even though we have the opportunity to do so, because that money won't be there when we get later on down the road and the economy starts to retract, which we're already seeing a little bit of. Other than that priority, though, obviously world-class education, which does not just mean throwing money at it, but actually solving the problems facing our administrators and our school districts. And then also, of course, it kind of goes hand in hand with responsible budgeting, is at the end of the line, the target is tax relief. We want to present a balanced budget, reduce our debt so that we don't need the income streams to maintain it at the same levels. Obviously, there's going to be taxes, but so that we won't have the same level of taxation that we're currently dealing with. Thank you.
Thanks. Mr. Davenport, same question. What are your top 3 policy issues? 2 minutes.
I've been spending a lot of time these last 2 months working every day talking with voters in our community, and a few things that I've been hearing from voters that have jumped up to the top have been really clear. The number one thing is to fully fund special education. Special education hasn't been fully funded in the state since 2011. And this past legislative session, it was funded at the lowest level it has been in the last decade. That's creating about a $10 million, between a $3 and $10 million deficit for every school district in Johnson County. Secondly, we need to address the child care issue. Businesses across the state are having issues with getting the workforce they need, and there are about 2 times as many children as there are places for child care in the state. So we need to elevate our private and public partnerships to increase access and affordability to child care, both to help children be in safe places and to unleash our workforce to help the business community. And then third, we've all been dealing with inflation, the rising costs of every good and service you can imagine. And so we need to address that by reducing our taxes. We need to cut our sales tax on food immediately, decrease our property tax, and also unleash our economic development potential to bring in new jobs and a broader tax base so that the tax burden can be lower on each individual family and business. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. And we'll stay with you, Mr. Davenport, starting with the next question. As was just mentioned, Kansas finished the most recent fiscal year with a budget surplus and is predicted to have surplus in each of the next 2 years as well. What are your views on state tax policy generally, and how would you propose using the additional revenues?
So it's true with COVID and a lot of the packages came from the federal government. It did send a lot of one-time funding to the states. But in addition to that, many governments at the local and state level also made changes to the way they were spending and using their current budget, anticipating a huge tank in our economy. And the reality is, sales tax outperformed any projections anybody could have thought. So in addition to the one-time costs, we also have an increased revenue stream from sales tax revenue. And so this year, when we're looking at this next legislative session, we're going to have tax cuts in the conversation, and it's a matter of which taxes we want to have cut. And so I think it's really important to think about having a balanced tax approach. You put the burden too high on the business community, then they can't employ the people they need, and they can't charge affordable prices. You put it too much on residential, on family, then they can't afford the goods and services. Their economy stalls, and so it has to be balanced. The Kansas House Democrats have put forth a tax policy that they're trying to use to reduce taxes, and it has a 3-pronged approach, and I reached out to them because I have concerns about 2 of those prongs. I will stand up to my party if the tax policy doesn't make sense for our community, and I have some concerns about the tax policy they put forth. But there is a line item in the state's budget that will reduce property taxes for residential property taxes. It gives property tax relief for local governments using sales tax revenue, and then the local governments can reduce property taxes. Secondly, there is an opportunity for the legislature this year to make a real impact in helping Kansas families on inflation. They could have got sales taxes to zero as of July 1. They funded that for political reasons. We need to cut state sales tax on food to 0 in January. Families like mine will be saving at least $55 a month in taxes that can go towards groceries. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Sutton, I'll work with you. Repeat the question. Kind of below them. Kansas finished the most recent fiscal year with budget surplus and is predicted to have a surplus in each of the next 2 years as well. What are your views on state tax policy generally, and how would you propose using the additional revenues?
All right. First off, no one should be surprised that sales tax revenues went up. We look at the economy, look at the inflation that we're dealing with. When the price of groceries goes up, does your tax percentage go down? No, it it stays exactly the same. So the price of, let's choose eggs for example, that went up like 65% in the last year. The tax revenue off of eggs went up 65% over the last year. No one should be surprised by that. The answer to using the money that comes from increased sales tax is to reduce the spending of the government. And what I mean by that is reduce debt. That's something that I'm very proud of that we succeeded in over, it's been a long battle, 10 years maybe, to get the Capers pension program under control. We've now got to the 80% funded mark, and I'm excited about that. But there are a lot of debts, a lot of bonds that are still out there that we can retire early and reduce the tax burden going forward. Not 2 years, not 3 years, but 10 years, 15 years. And this is how we develop a responsible budget that can actually reduce taxes in the long term. And in addition to that, I'm glad you mentioned the grocery sales tax cut. Argued vehemently on that in 2019, and we finally got it passed, and then it was vetoed. But that's okay. It's in effect now. The exact same bill came back up, and we passed it. But I'm also in support of Derek Schmidt's retirement tax relief program. I think that's really well thought out. Oh, I've got to stop now. I'll come back to that later.
Staying with you, Mr. Sutton, switching gears a little bit towards economic development. What types of economic development policies do you support to encourage job growth and business expansion in Kansas?
All right. Just so happens I came in hot this afternoon. I was just at the BizPac meeting in Kansas City, and we were having exactly this discussion. I think first off, I would hold the Apex bill up as a perfect example of economic development, because it doesn't target one specific company. It targets an industry. So not just, well, as it turns out, Panasonic, but also their suppliers. And the people who provide support are also included in this. Right now, as it is currently shaking out, we're at about, I wrote it down so I made sure I can quote the right number for you, but we're somewhere in the neighborhood of about $5 billion promised in infrastructure development and 8,000 jobs. That's huge, folks. But 8,000 jobs in DeSoto, Kansas. That's going to be developing the area all around us. Here in Garnder, Lawrence, Tonganoxie, DeSoto, all these communities are going to be benefiting greatly, and of course the state will as well. I went off the track here. What was the question again?
You're on the line, economic development policies do you support for job growth and business expansion? Very
good, very good. In addition to that, we've got to keep Kansas students in Kansas. So 62%, by the way, of college graduates leave the state. So I'm really happy about the Kansas Promise Act that we passed this year, that we expanded this year rather, that allows people who might not attend higher education to get their 2-year degree in return for staying in Kansas for 2 years. I'm going to have to come back to this one too.
We'll circle back a little bit on that one.
I can keep going.
Yeah. Mr. Davenport, any questions? What type of economic development policies do you support to encourage job growth and business expansion in Kansas?
There's this old story that is told a lot about the use of tax incentives for economic development, and it's like when you go to a football game, if everybody's sitting in the bleachers, everybody can see really well. But as soon as one person stands up or a second person stands up, everybody has to stand up in order for anybody to be able to see anymore. That's how tax incentives work too. We all would be fine as far as economic development goes if nobody used tax incentives. But since many communities do, we have to use them to compete. So I support a full range of economic development and tax incentives to bring businesses and attract them to our community. I think with these three caveats. One is economic development is best done at a local level with local governments, chambers of commerce, and regional economic development organizations leading the charge there because they know what their community needs. Think about our Main Street here in Garnder. You wouldn't want the state deciding what types of businesses are coming to Main Street in Garnder, right? Because they don't know as well as the people here in town. The second caveat is there is so much data nationally about what types of tax incentives and economic development strategies actually are effective at achieving their goals. And there's no reason why we should be ever using any sort of approaches that aren't proven to be effective. And those contracts and those agreements have to be managed effectively to make sure the developers and the businesses are living up to their end of the deal. And then the third caveat is economic development and tax incentives always have to include clawbacks. That means if the developer or the business doesn't live up to their end of the deal, they have to pay those taxes back. If you look at that Apex deal that was done with the state, you'll see that they missed the mark on a couple of those, including the Commerce Committee that was working on that, because they didn't require the clawbacks for the exact number of jobs and where those jobs were going to be located. And so that could really potentially hurt our region by not having the good clawbacks included in that. Thank you.
We both mentioned Apex, and we're going to stay with that and dive a little deeper on it. As mentioned last session, the Apex legislation led to the Panasonic battery plant project in DeSoto. How will this project affect the Garnder area, and what should you do as the local representative to help provide the best outcome for Garnder businesses and residents? Mr. Davenport first.
I actually had the great opportunity to talk with some of our local business owners and our city staff and elected officials on this very issue. One of the things that comes to the forefront of our mind is Main Street right now. I don't know if you drove that on the way here, but there's construction there that has been there for a long time and should have been finished a long time ago. Of course, KDOT lost about $2 billion of its money to go someplace else because of poor tax policy. And so right now the city's really struggling, working with KDOT to figure out what our long-term plans are for both Main Street and then the interchange at Garnder Road on the I-35. That there are actually developers who want to develop land in town right now who can't because of the requirements of the state for the way that entrances and exits onto Garnder Road happen. So one of the things that I think will be really important and that I would do is working alongside our city government to advocate to the state to get local solutions that help us develop the transit capacity we need in town. Secondly, we're really looking at trying to attract 4,000 new families into the area in order for us to help develop some of that economic benefit. And so we need to make sure our public schools are top of the line because when a family's looking where they live, if you look at special education communities, for example, the first thing they do on a Facebook group is which school has the best special education. And then whatever they say, no matter where it is, even if it's a long way away from work, that's where they move. And so our public schools have to be the best in line to that. So making sure that we're having special education fully funded and our schools working at the highest level possible. And then third, we really have to lean into what our long-term plan is here locally, and that really, in many ways, is a local level piece to figure out what types of businesses do we want on Main Street, and then are there some of the 4,000 auxiliary jobs that come in addition to the Panasonic plant that we could pull those businesses into town here and help our local economy.
Great, thank you. Mr. Sutton, again, how will the Panasonic plant project affect Garnder area, and what should you do as a local representative to help provide the best outcome for Garnder businesses and residents?
Well, my opponent is exactly correct that transportation is going to be key there. The funding has already been approved for the Garnder overpass, by the way, but we just haven't gotten it slated in as a high enough priority to KDOT yet, so I'm still working on that one. However, that's not going to do anything for DeSoto, connecting us to DeSoto. So we're going to have to look at how we connect ourselves to I-70 or K-10 or the giant loop. What was it? The outer loop has been on the drawing board for the last 30 years probably. I think this is going to be an excellent way to kind of kickstart that because we're going to need access to the Panasonic plant. Going out 175th to Edgerton Road isn't going to do it for 8,000 employees. So we're definitely going to have to look at developing that outer loop or at least our portion of it. I can't say we're going to connect all the way up to Leavenworth and cross the river. But I think this is going to be an excellent opportunity for us to develop the transportation necessary to get our people to DeSoto and back again, so that they can call Garnder home when they're working at the Panasonic plant. 30 seconds. Okay, I've marked it this time. All right. The other thing that we're going to have to, and this is going to be more of a local issue, but we're going to have to deal with the housing requirements that we're going to have with this many people moving to the area. DeSoto doesn't have the housing to support all of that. I think we're going to have a great boon in our population here in Garnder, and we're going to have to plan for it accordingly, and that's something that we'll have to work out with local officials.
Staying with you, Mr. Sutton, changing gears to education. Economists and social scientists have said that education provides the highest return on investment with regard to wages and income. What are your views on K-12 education funding and accessibility?
All right. There was a very, very long discussion, like 10 years, 9 years discussion called the Gannon case, where, in the Constitution, the Kansas Constitution, it says that the legislature shall make suitable funding available for public education. And we all agreed with that, but we didn't know what suitable meant. What number is that? How do you target that? What is the base state aid per pupil that is right, that is appropriate? And like I said, this was a 9-year discussion with the Gannon decision. In 2018, we finally came to an understanding with the Supreme Court as to what that base state aid number is. And so we funded it at that level, indexed for inflation, ever since that decision was made, ever since it was clarified what is base state aid per pupil. We've continued that, and I have absolutely no will to change that progression. I am worried that with higher inflation, it's going to be very difficult in 5, 6, 7 years, but we'll deal with that when the time comes. But as it stands, I think the Supreme Court made a good decision. We're sticking by it, and I think that our funding level is exactly where it needs to be for the Supreme Court, anyway.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Davenport, same question. Economists and social scientists have said that education provides the highest return on investment with regard to wages and income. What are your views on K-12 education funding and accessibility?
Probably of all the issues we're going to discuss tonight, this is the one where me and my opponent are farthest apart. All of the 4 organizations that endorse candidates for public education in this race, all 4 have endorsed me over my candidate. 2 of them have particularly called out my opponent for his continued voting against public education. The main PAC has rated him in 6 of the last 7 years with a 0 out of 100 score on education voting. In the Game On for Kansas Schools, called out only 8 legislators across all of Johnson County and all of Wyandotte County who they marked as academically ineligible, and Representative Sutton was on that list for his consistent voting against public education. Let me tell you about my 6-year-old. He loves his teacher, Mrs. Dewey. And we took our family to the homecoming football game, and Mrs. Dewey happened to be sitting about 6 or 7 rows behind us. And throughout the whole game, he kept looking back and saying, "Mrs. Dewey, Mrs. Dewey!" And finally he's like, "Hey, buddy, she's here with her family, just leave her alone." A few minutes later, my phone buzzes, and I look at it, it was Mrs. Dewey who texted me, who said, "He's fine, I love your son, he's great." It's our teachers that make our school great. And in Kansas right now, we have a shortage of about 1,000 teachers. If you're locally, we have at least a dozen openings for paraeducators. If we want to continue to have the outcomes that research is saying for our workforce, we have to continue to invest in our public education. We have to fully fund special education. And we have to stop the rhetoric that puts teachers and parents against each other and make sure our community knows that parents and teachers work together for the good of their kids. Thank you.
Thank you. Staying in the education realm, in the last 30 years, tuition costs of college have risen from just over $4,000 to more more than $10,000 even after accounting for inflation. The average student loan debt in Kansas is $26,000. What are your views on the state's role with respect to ensuring access and affordability of post-secondary education?
Those of you who have been following my campaign social media, you probably saw the pictures of the coffee cups that I've had over the last few months where the coffee shop often gets my name wrong, calling me Zeke or Chief or Keith or various things. Well, funny thing is, I mean, just this week I was at a coffee shop and they got my name wrong and I was joking with them and somebody asked me, what's your favorite coffee here? And I said, Irishman, that's what I always get. And the Irishman, I first tried it because a college student I was working with at JCCC told me it was her favorite. And so I tried it out and it was great. Throughout this campaign, I've been working with college students over and over again who are just engaged in the civic process, who have been volunteering with the campaign over and over again. Well, I worked at Johnson County Community College right after the recession in 2008-2009 area. And at that time, the state was reducing support for higher education and increasing the regulations and indicators on how they were getting funding. And if you look at the history from that day, enrollment in our state colleges and universities has been increasing every year for the past 10 years on that. We really need to look at that, both the funding model and then the way in which we're evaluating our colleges and universities to make sure that that's working for them. They're essential for our long-term workforce and economic development needs. And then also when you think about our rural development and trying to bring people back out to those professional services without students being able to afford colleges and universities, we're not going to be able to fill those needs we have in those communities.
Mr. Sutton, I'll repeat the question. It was a long one. In the last 30 years, tuition costs of colleges have risen from just over $4,000 to more than $10,000, even after accounting for inflation. Average student loan debt in Kansas is $26,000. What are your views on the state's role with respect to ensuring access and affordability of post-secondary education?
Right, that is, I would like to point out, however, we have a brief moment of bipartisanship that I also pick the Irishman. That's also my choice. That's my favorite. All right. College education. Did I turn the mic off? Hello? I turned it off. Are we on? Okay.
Yeah.
College education has skyrocketed. I don't think anyone's surprised or shocked by this. This is a nationwide problem. And we can get into the causes behind that. Guaranteed student loans would certainly be a part of it, but that's not something that we can handle at the state level. There are a couple of initiatives that we're working on currently. In fact, I just met last week, or the week before, it's all run together, but with the Western Governors University advocates, and they were discussing a program in Iowa that I'm really interested in exploring a little bit further. It's a parent-to-teacher college program, scheduled so that they can attend either at night or online. But we could actually market our para positions to provide a degree program to get them to being a teacher, addressing the teacher shortage. I know this isn't exactly what we were talking about, but it's in the same vein. We need to develop our workforce, and that means adults too. That doesn't just mean kids. That means adults too, to fill a vital role in our community that, you're right, we're short of. Nationwide, we're short on teachers. This is a way that we can bridge that gap and get the help that we need in a way that could be very, very cost effective.
Staying with you, Mr. Sutton, and I guess you can kind of continue your answer because we're going to move up from education into what happens next, and that is workforce. So what would you do to grow and develop the state's workforce?
All right, well, that really falls into three categories. First, we have to stop the out-migration, and I think the retirement tax plan is an excellent way to do that. Is that going to directly influence the workforce itself? No, they're retired. But we may very well have people who stick with their family, and that's going to be a little bit of a benefit. So I definitely want to explore that option. But as far as workforce development is concerned, there are a couple of other factors. First, we have to keep our college kids in Kansas. That's where the Kansas Promise Act really comes into play, because they'll have 2 years. And the reason we chose that 2 years is that is an incremental time, an important time in a person's life when right after college they're making family decisions, they're making residence decisions, they're making job decisions. And so if we can keep them in Kansas through that 2-year period, we feel like we'll have a very high chance of keeping them in the state long term. So that's why that 2 years was chosen for the Kansas Promise Act. I would also emphasize something that we do very well here in Garnder is the tech ed that we have available at the high school. We can develop that further. We can have kids graduating with certificates immediately employable, not having to worry about student loans, not having to worry about where to find a job. Very likely they've been working with that employer or a representative of that employer right there in the high school. This to me is going to be key for keeping our workforce and building a workforce that's going to be able to support the businesses that are coming in.
Mr. Davenport, what would you do to grow and develop the state's workforce?
Just about a week and a half ago, I was in St. Louis presenting at a national conference of business leaders on employee retention. That's the number one issue that almost every business, regardless of your size, is working with now. Unemployment is great for the people looking for jobs, but for businesses, it creates challenges in filling those roles. The number one thing I'm hearing when I'm working with economic developers across eastern Kansas and Missouri in my day job is childcare. They can't get the workforce they need, particularly for entry-level jobs, because people can't afford to work those jobs and still pay for childcare. So childcare is so expensive. And so we're starting to see some really promising local and regional initiatives where economic development organizations are working with local businesses to develop new childcare providers in the local city that is more affordable. They build it to intentionally meet their needs, and they can make it in proximity to where the jobs are. And so I think that by expanding our private-public partnerships for childcare, we're able to get more employees available to come work in those places. Also, with the continued movement towards remote learning, remote working, expanding broadband across the state is going to be essential. It lets us tap into the workforce from anywhere to fill the jobs for many different businesses. We also need to really continue to think about the ways in which our state government is partnering with our local business community. I think it's important as a state representative that I would be talking to local business owners and not just make assumptions about generalities around workforce needs, but actually say, hey, what type of workforce do you need? What type of employer are you looking for? And be able to help connect the dots between local business owners, community colleges and technical schools, and then four-year colleges and universities to make sure we have that workforce pipeline going. It's industry specific to meet the needs that Kansas needs across the state.
Thank you. And sticking with workforce issues and diving a little deeper, perhaps expanding on your previous answer, childcare availability and healthcare policy are cited as two primary impediments for workers joining or rejoining the workforce. What can the legislature do to assist businesses in addressing these two issues?
Well, got a little bit of the game on the child care conversation there, and start talking about it. One model that I've already had some brief conversations with Johnson County government on is, so nationally, a lot of local governments use transit authorities. So what they do is they create a separate entity that works on community transportation. And all the businesses in the area put in funds to that so they can build it to scale, and then it allows them to bring employees to their place of work at the times they need employees. And it works really well. I think that's a model that we could probably bring over for childcare. And so already the state provides tax credits to businesses who provide childcare for their employees, but it's not enough money to make it to scale to provide in-house childcare in a business. However, if we were to partner with local government, we can create a childcare authority where multiple businesses can pool their tax incentives together to fund that. Did you know that Johnson County Parks and Recreation District is the largest child care provider in the state of Kansas. Here locally, we already have the infrastructure to be able to provide that need in a way that can completely take that to scale and make those tax cap dollars go a lot farther without additional expense for the state and with a lot higher return on investment for local businesses. So that would be significant. In healthcare, and I'm hoping we're having an opportunity to talk about this a little bit more, we've got to expand Medicaid. That's clear and simple. It's popular. 72% of all Kansans, a report came out yesterday, 72% of all Kansans support Medicaid expansion, including the majority of Republicans. 38 states have expanded Medicaid across the country. The Kansas Health Institute estimates that it would save private businesses between $40 and $80 million in Kansas annually. It is winning for Kansas health. It's winning for our economy. It's winning for the costs to our state. It's winning towards even criminal justice in the mental health and healthcare systems because more people will get the mental health care they need, and it will have less people with mental illness in jails. Thank you.
Mr. Sutton, child care availability and healthcare policy are cited as two primary impediments for workers joining or rejoining the workforce. What can the legislature do to assist businesses in addressing these two issues?
Right. Well, first off, I really liked the answer about the Johnson County setting up a child care facility. I think that's not a bad idea. One thing that I want to look at before or in addition to probably that would be reducing the barrier to entry. I've talked to some child care providers, and they don't feel like the ongoing regulations are particularly burdensome, like continuing education and that sort of thing. I don't find that particularly burdensome, but the barriers to entry, the weight, the licensing that has to take place really does, I think, keep a lot of people out of that industry. And it is an important industry. It's something that we need to focus on. So that's something that I would definitely want to climb through the regulations that have been put in place by the agencies to eliminate ones that are barriers to entry. Now I'm going to, switching over to healthcare here, I'm going to differ, oddly enough, with my opponent on this one. We've seen the numbers. The outcomes for Medicaid patients are no different than those who are uninsured entirely. Now, why is that, do you think? When I try to think in my head if I could draw a comparison here. Say there's one checkout line in Walmart, and you go from 50 customers to 100 customers. Do you get the service you're expecting? No, of course not. And people aren't receiving the service that they're expecting in states that have expanded Medicaid. You've increased the supply of customers, but you haven't done nothing to the availability of physicians to treat those customers. Okay.
Okay, changing gears again, Mr. Sutton, we'll start with you on this one. How control over decision-making is divided among the state legislature and local governments, including local school boards, on issues such as taxation, economic development, and education has been a matter of debate. What are your views on this issue?
We also have that debate over federal and state. So that's an ongoing debate everywhere. Who gets to make the decisions? I think in my view of government in general, there is a role for the state government, obviously, to make sure regulations are uniform across the state so businesses don't have to change mode every time they go to a different town or a different county. Obviously, the budget is something that's got to be handled by the state. That's where the money comes in. That's where it's got to go from. But generally speaking, I would say that the decisions need to be made closest to the people who are affected by them. Now, you touched on economic development. That's not something that a town or a county is necessarily going to be able to do. That's more of an economy of scale sort of situation. So we really need to handle a lot of that from from the state level with buy-in from the local communities that are affected by it. But in general, I would say that decisions need to be made closest to the issues that they're trying to solve.
Mr. Davenport, how control over decision-making is divided among the state legislature and local governments, including local school boards, on issues such as taxation, economic development, and education has been a matter of debate. What are your views on this issue?
So I agree with my opponent that decisions have to be made at the local level. The difference there is that my opponent's votes don't actually represent and reflect what he just said was his opinion. In fact, this year in particular, he voted to take away the power of local school boards to set their own enrollment policies. You look at broader about economic development, the state has required the city governments and school boards to budget in a very specific way. They don't have power to set their own way to do budget modeling. They've taken away the power to do some types of tax incentives for economic development, even though I literally, my job every day is working with local economic development enterprises that do that on a local level. And so the state is continuing to tie their hands and having to go to the state to get approval to do things at the local level. So while what he says is he supports local government, his votes say a very different story. In fact, if you look at the last several years of the state legislature, they continue to take away and overrule city rulings. In fact, if they don't like the way a city council votes on a topic, or if they pass an ordinance, often this legislature will come back and pass a law to nullify the ordinance the local government made. Let's do some math. What percentage of our city council does our community get to vote for? 100%. What percentage of our school board does our community get to vote for? 100%. What percentage of our county commission does our community get to vote for? That's a little bit harder. It's 2 out of 7, so 28%. What percentage of our legislature does our community get to vote for? 1%. So if you don't like the decisions that our city council makes, within 4 years you can vote them all out. If you don't like the decisions our school board makes, within 4 years you can vote them all out. If you don't like the decisions the legislature makes, you only ever can change one. That's an important role for statewide governance, but our votes have to match what we're saying in front of our people.
Our last question before we move to closing statements. There's no open question. Mr. Davenport, we'll start with you. What should Garnder residents know about you that hasn't been addressed already?
That's a great question. So for these last 5 months, I've been working 7 days a week to connect with voters across the community. I've been hosting public events almost every week where voters, regardless of their party, can come and ask me questions and I can give them answers. I have plans to work on town halls where anybody, not just people who are my friends or part of my party, can come and ask me questions after I'm in office and challenge me in the history of my vote. People email me, I'll reply to them. I'll send regular newsletters. I'll be up. You already see my social media updating every day. I am going to be present in the community because representative, it's literally in the job title. You can't represent the community if you don't host town halls. You can't represent the community if you don't make yourself open to the public asking you questions. You can't represent the community if you don't tell the community what you're voting on. You can't represent the community if there's constitutional amendments coming up on the ballot that you haven't even told them is happening or why they should or shouldn't vote someplace. I will represent our community because our community deserves representation in Topeka.
Thank you. Mr. Sutton, what should Garnder residents know about you that hasn't been addressed already?
I've been in office for 10 years. I think it's been addressed. What is it that you don't know about me that hasn't come out yet? Tough to say. I think that I know everyone in this room. I think I've talked on the doorstep with 100 billion people, if you count how many times I've come back and forth over the years. If there's been a question that hasn't been asked, I don't know what it is. I've been knocking doors for 10 years, literally, every year, not just during the legislative election, but during school board and city council races. You'll always find me there. I'm not sure if there's any question that hasn't been asked that hasn't already been answered.
And in reverse order from our opening statements, we'll now have our closing statements. And Mr. Sutton, you are first on 3 minutes for closing statements.
All right, very good. Well, there were a couple of issues brought up that I would like to discuss. First off, thanks for sticking with us. I know this is very exciting work, and so I'm grateful that I think everyone's eyes are still open. So I think that's a nice credit to you on that one. But one of the things that came up that I really do want to touch on would be the K-12 education. We keep talking about how it's been cut and it's decimated and it's not doing its job. And I just happened to have the numbers from 2013 to 2022. In 2013, the K-12 education budget was $3.26 billion. That was, by the way, found to be unconstitutional in that Gannon discussion that I was talking to you about earlier. But in 2022, that budget is $5.297 billion. That's a 62% increase. SPED has been brought up a few times. If we had gone with the fully funded model in 2011, even though it was found to be unconstitutional, so we couldn't do that. But had we fully funded it with the 2012 school finance formula, as has been suggested, that would be $376 million. Currently, it's at $520 million. You see, you can't look at the 2012 education budget and apply it to the 2018 Gannon decision education budget. The two are apples and oranges. The full 92% that was outlined in 2012, yeah, that's $376 million. Who's going to back that when they know that with the current plan, it's $520? That's pretty significant. That's a $150 million difference. So I have to take exception when I hear, oh, SPED isn't funded, oh, K-12 isn't funded. Those numbers are real, and those numbers have passed court muster, which makes it even probably more credible, I think. Otherwise, thanks for being here, thanks for having us, and hope you have a wonderful, wonderful evening.
Thank you. Mr. Davenport, closing statements, 3 minutes.
It's really impressive to throw around some million-dollar numbers, but they don't really mean a lot when you just put numbers out there to everybody. Here's the reality. Special education is something that local school districts have to provide to their students at a federal level. And so the federal government is supposed to give some money, and then the state government is supposed to provide 92% of what's left over. And whatever's in the middle, the local school district has to pay for it. So it's great that the numbers increase, that's right, but we actually had enough revenue from the increased sales tax revenue this year to fully fund special education at 100% without even dipping into half of the revenue surplus that we had this year. And so when we don't fund special education at that 92% statutory required level, what we do is we pass that deficit on to local school districts. In the USD 231, our school district probably have an estimated $5 million deficit just because this was not funded. So it's great to be able to throw some exciting numbers out there, but what that means is the local school district has to move money from every classroom into the special education budget, and so every single teacher and every single student hurts because of that $5 million deficit. Special education has to be funded. No compromise on that issue. And there's plans to get it done. When I worked in the Johnson County manager's office, I was working there one Friday afternoon, and I got a phone call from a friend of mine who worked in another department. And he had a panic sound in his voice. He said, "Hey, our building's being evacuated. The police are here. The police are here." And so I said, "Okay, we're going to work on messaging." I hung up. I went over to the chief of staff, and we started working on messaging to make sure that the public knew not to come to that building, that our employees were avoiding the area, and got it all ready to go. And just when I was about ready to hit send on the messaging, I got a phone call back saying, "Hey, the police have given a Well, that was a relief. But what I realized after the fact is we have a lot of loopholes and broken processes for emergency communications. So I brought together representatives from all 35 departments and agencies in Johnson County government, and we worked on a crisis communication plan to make sure that that didn't happen again, and we can keep our community and our employees safe for the long term. We need a representative who can respond in a crisis, but can also bring people together from all over the place to come up with long-term solutions, and that's what I want to bring to Topeka. I worked at Johnson County Community College, and I was in charge of the call center for a while, and I started looking at the data and found that about half of the students who called in to register were hanging up before they talked to anybody. So they had an hour wait time at the time. I took the data to my boss, she didn't do anything about it, went all the way up to the president's office and said, hey, we got a problem here. Well, now, if you go to register for classes at JCCC, you can do it easily online, because they changed that process after I brought that data forward. The same passion I brought for student success at JCCC and a data-driven approach to a solution is what I want to bring to Topeka. Thank you for your time.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, every notice, please help me in thanking candidates. On behalf of the chamber, I do want to say thank you very much for your willingness to be here this evening, being able to provide reviews to both the attendees here and online. And for those of you here, if you've not received a card, we have some more up front, just a little bit of information about the upcoming election. October